Thank you for coming along to our first Census Data seminar in Sydney. It's really exciting to be here. I hope you love data as much as I do. If you don't, hopefully by the end of this session you'll love data a little bit more. My name is Duncan Young. I'm the 2016 Census Program Manager. It's actually my birthday next week, my census birthday. We only get that's when you've been in the census program for 5 years. A few of my colleagues have actually had their 6th birthday, but it's actually just my first birthday next week. So 5 years in the census program. So I'm getting to a point where I've seen it from the start to the end, and I must say this part of it is a lot of fun. Certainly a lot more fun than August the 9th was, so I can tell you that. I'm going to be joined today, tag teaming a little bit so that you don't get sick of my voice, with one of my colleagues, Sue Taylor, who's the Census Director of Data. And so between us, we'll be sharing with you some of the insights that we've seen in the census data and hopefully whetting your appetite to sort of get a little bit more into census data after tonight. I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the lands of the Gadigal people and pay my respects to their elders, both past and present, and acknowledge anyone in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community who are here with us today or tuned into our webcast. So this session is being live webcasted, so when you're asking questions, you'll be going to the same audience that we're going to right now. So a bit worried here in New South Wales that we might not get a good turn up tonight, given that it's State of Origin night and given that New South Wales seems to have some kind of chance. And so I thought I better not, I'd sort of leave you without any sort of State of Origin picture. So I thought I'd give you a bit of the statistician's take on the State of Origin. So Blues versus Maroons, so it's the grand battle. Some 52.1% of Australia's people are in New South Wales or Queensland, so no wonder this rivalry generates some interest. So right at the start, the Blues take a little bit of a lead in a population state. New South Wales, the largest state in the country, he first points to the Blues. But when we looked at growth rate over the last 5 years, Queensland hit back with a faster growth rate over the last 5 years. But the Blues, if we look at NRL or aged males, so 18 to 35-year-olds in New South Wales, again the Blues have pulled ahead. But what we've noticed across the NRL is a number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander coaches and players. And so we looked at the Indigenous population in Queensland and New South Wales, and there's a higher proportion of the Queensland population are Indigenous, not to mention the number of Kiwis. And so stepping a little bit further to housing costs, and Maroons have now got their nose in front with lower mortgages and lower rent than New South Wales. But we all know that the players don't play for no money, and so when we look at the cash picture, household incomes in New South Wales are clearly ahead of the Maroons. But I think we should actually think about our good citizens. Every NRL player is a good citizen. So which state is more likely to care for people with disabilities? I note, or which one's more likely to clean up around the house? It's actually the Maroons. Who's more likely to care? It's actually the blue baggers. And so here we are sort of tied up at the end, and so I thought, how do we split the Maroons and the Blues? I thought, well, what's been really important to me is the level of online response. So we've got Maroons with some 62.9% of persons in Queensland responding online. So compared to New South Wales, the final deciding factor, 64.9%. So based on location, I couldn't declare anyone else a winner anyway, but I'll give the statistical State of Origin to the Blues tonight. So the census is more than just comparing states against states for the State of Origin. The census is our most comprehensive and detailed data set of Australia's people and the households in which we live. The census is a beautiful data set by itself, but the census is actually used in order for us to produce our population estimates in Australia. So the ABS produces population estimates every 3 months, and these are used for setting of electoral boundaries, setting of a number of electoral seats, and the allocation of government funding right across the country. Census is used right across government planning, government administration, policy development. If you want to know where you need to build a new school, if you want to know where a hospital might be required, then you can turn to the census to find that out. The census actually also underpins all of the ABS's 500 statistical releases a year, whether it's social statistics or economic business statistics. We need the basis of a census to benchmark that data and provide the basis of all of the statistics that you see come out from the Australian Bureau of Stats. The census is also our most used data sets by communities, by businesses, by researchers. It's something that actually every Australian can see themselves in and many Australians take advantage of. So it's been some months since August 9, and so what have we been doing? So we received some 8.5 million in household forms and 750,000 personal forms. And whilst the majority of people did it online, there's still some 3.5 million paper forms for us to deal with. And I can tell you that doctors aren't the only people in Australia with messy handwriting. So we had about 700 staff bring together to try and turn what people have written in the form, what they've marked on the form, into the beautiful statistics we're going to share today. We've conducted some 5.3 billion data transactions, some 23 million clerical operations to produce some 68.9 million pieces of data that we released a couple of weeks ago. We've assembled that up into some 2.8 million tables, and we're going to go through all of those tonight. Actually, they tell me if I actually went through every one of those 68.9 million pieces of data, we'd be here for 2 years without sleeping if we gave every piece of data 1 second each. So we'll just keep to some highlights. So in terms of the census overall, we ended up with a very high quality census in 2016. So we had a 95.1% response rate in the census. If any of you have ever conducted a survey, you'd be pretty rapt if you got yourself a response rate over 95%. And we had that sort of compared with our previous efforts. We had that compared internationally with benchmarks, and our independent assurance panel of esteemed Australians, they actually said, yeah, this is a high quality census and comparable with what we've seen before. We actually saw an online response rate at 63.2%. It wasn't quite the 65% that we were aiming for, but it was some 80% higher than what we saw in 2011. And why is that important to us from a data quality perspective? What we see when people fill out the form online is they actually leave less questions blank and they actually provide better answers across the questions. And we actually had all these smarts in the online form this time. So if we asked you what your occupation was and you wrote in teacher, it would actually come back to you and say, actually, we know about lots of different teachers. Which one of these teachers are you? Because if you're trying to plan and for teachers and schools, you need to know primary school teachers versus secondary teachers versus TAFE teachers. So we've got all this richer data through the online form. Finally, we do a really important quality check to the census where we go out and run another survey. We love surveys at the ABS. We run another survey after a census where we go to 50,000 households in order to try and work out how many people were counted twice in a census and how many people were missed in a census. And so what we've ended up with this census is a net undercount of 1.0%. So the census number is effectively 99% of what we thought was in Australia on census night. So good stories there to start with, but let's get to the data. So to Australia, 23,401,892 usual residents counted on census night. So we also counted on census night about a bit over 300,000 overseas visitors in Australia, but we leave those out of our usual resident count. What we don't count in the census is all the people who are overseas on census night. So it was over 600,000 people overseas on census night, travelling somewhere else. But what we do is we get information from the Department of Immigration so that we can add them back in when we produce the population estimates. And so from the census, we were able to work out that by December 31st last year, Australia's population had grown to some 24.4 million people. Now, Australia's population increased 8.8% over the last 5 years and has doubled since 1966. And it's actually doubled again since 1921. So when my grandparents were first around, Australia is now 4 times the size within their lifetime. So where do Australians live? Well, here in New South Wales, we have nearly a third of the country with some 7.5 million people counted in the census, followed by Victoria in second place with 5.9 million. We actually found in this census some 80% of Australia's population are in one of the 3 eastern states of the ACT. So if we were sort of floating as an island, we'd be a bit lopsided right now with 80% of Australia right across on the eastern side. But when we look at the growth rates between censuses, how the census counts have changed between censuses, we see quite a bit of variance from state and territory. We've got what I like to think of as Australia's best kept secrets, South Australia and Tasmania, growth rates of only 3% and 5%. And then we've got New South Wales, Queensland and Northern Territory, which all grew between 8 and 9%, but below the national average over the last 5 years. We've got 2 states and 1 territory which are really dragging up Australia's growth at times. So WA with 10.5%, Victoria 10.7% and ACT with 11.2% increase in census count over the last 5 years. So where do we live within our states? Well, interestingly, whilst we've got all of these interesting places around Australia, some 2/3 of us live in one of Australia's capital cities, and this is an increasing proportion. So over the last 5 years, there's 10.5% growth in capital cities versus a 5.7% growth outside the capital cities. So capital cities are larger and getting larger. One of the reasons for this we found, I found this quite staggering, was we looked at all of the people which had arrived from overseas over the last 25 years and try to look at where they ended up in Australia. And so of all of our immigration over the last 25 years, some 86% of them have ended up calling a capital city home. So international migration is really feeding this growth of our capital cities. If we look at this a little bit closer to home, it's actually a very similar picture in New South Wales. So it's slightly less concentrated in Sydney compared to the rest of Australia versus the balance of the state. I was in Victoria yesterday. There are actually 3/4 of the population are in Melbourne and only 1/4 outside of Melbourne. So to capital city growth rate, what we saw was Darwin was actually our fastest growing capital city over the last 5 years, with some 13.5% growth compared to 12.4% in Perth and Melbourne in 3rd place. But let's focus a little bit on Sydney versus Melbourne here. I know that there's a little bit of rivalry here at the time, and Sydney's still the number one capital city in the country in terms of population. But what you can see here in this chart is that whilst through sort of 2000 or so, like the Sydney Olympics kind of time, Sydney was drawing away from Melbourne, and no one would have settled down in cold, windy, wet Melbourne. But over the last 10 years, we've seen this dramatic sort of climb from Melbourne, which is getting closer and closer to Sydney. So over the last 5 years, whilst we've seen 1,656 people every single week decide to call Sydney home, we've seen 1,859 people decide to call Melbourne home. And so we're going to come up with some projections a little bit later this year, and one of the interesting things will be when we project to see where on current trajectory these lines might meet. Forgive me, I'm going to get pretty excited about these age pyramids. Statisticians love a good age pyramid. What these age pyramids show you is males on the right, females on the left, and the proportion of each of the population made up of each age group. So at the bottom, we've got the beautiful little babies, the 0 to 4 year olds, and at the top, we've got the beautiful 95 plus year olds. And so what you can see here is a picture of Australia back in 1991, some 25 years ago. And what we can see here is that the most, popular age or most common age was 30 to 34 year old, and a really sort of solid block of ages at the bottom there, all the way up to 40 to 44. And then bit of a pyramid effect after that point. Now, if we move forward now to 2016, and what we saw in this census, we can see a bit of a different picture. We've got here what's called the middle age spread. And so what we can see here is a bit of a bite out of the younger ages here, and certainly a bit of a growth in the older ages through to sort of 69 or so. So we've seen a significant ageing of Australia's population over the last 25 years. And in fact, we've found in this census now, 1 in every 6 Australians is over the age of 65. And if we travel south to Tasmania, you actually find that 1 in every 5 Tasmanians are over the age of 65. So certainly an ageing population. Some of the biggest changes we've seen, though, are actually right at the top end of that graph. And so if you look at right at the top 3 bars there, people 85 years or older, you'll see, you might be able to work it out if you're good with numbers, there's 486,842 Australians now aged 85 years or older. That's a big number. That's like the population of Tasmania. It's not actually the population of Tasmania, but it's a similar size to a population of Tasmania. So seeing this sort of shift and change. Now let's have a look here in New South Wales at the difference between a population in Sydney versus a population in the rest of New South Wales. So what we've got here is a population of Sydney in orange and a population of the rest of New South Wales in blue. What you can actually see here is a younger population in Sydney and an older population in New South Wales, the rest of the state. But what you're not seeing here is Sydney being a 1991 population. You're seeing a population which still has quite a small base to it, so low levels of births relatively, but a large sort of boom out between the ages of 20 and 39, which is reflective of migration, both internal and international, into Sydney as a home, in those kind of student ages, working ages, into the state. Whereas what you're seeing in the rest of the state is a population which is getting older even faster than the rest of the nation. So this was the 50th anniversary this year of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, the referendum that led to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders being fully included in the Australian census. And what we saw in this census was 649,171 Australians identified as having Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander origin. This is an increase of 18.3% over the last 5 years, so a more significant increase than we've seen across the population as a whole. But nearly all of this increase has occurred in the eastern states of Australia. So the New South Wales Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population has increased by some 25% over the last 5 years. The Queensland population has increased by 20% over the last 5 years, whereas the Northern Territory population has only increased by 3% over the last 5 years. Here's another one of those age pyramids, and the blue one, and you've seen something very similar to before. So the Australian population or the non-Indigenous population, they're both very similar with this kind of middle-aged spread kind of shape. But the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population is a much younger population. And so you can see big differences at the bottom end. Over half the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population are under the age of 25, compared to only 30% of the non-Indigenous population. And you can see a big difference at the top end, where I mentioned before, 1 in 6 of the Australian population are over the age of 65, compared to 1 in 20 of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population. So this reflects both birth rates, fertility, but also lower life expectancy. We have seen life expectancy in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community increase from 21 to 23 over the last 5 years, but that's much lower than 38 for the non-Indigenous population of Australia. In terms of where our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population lives, some 62% of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population live in one of our state of origin states, in New South Wales or Queensland. But if we look at the proportion of a state that's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, Northern Territory stands out, where over a quarter of the population have indicated that they have Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander origin, compared to New South Wales with 2.9%. So within New South Wales, this is a chart of different areas of New South Wales and the count of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in each area. Whereas 2/3 of the state, its population lives in Sydney, only 1/3 of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population live in Sydney. So some 70,135 people identified as being Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander origin in the city. What you can see here is as the colours get darker, they're higher counts of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population. So clearly it's more towards the north of the state and out to the west of the state. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Sue to lead us through some of the cultural and linguistic diversity of Australia.
Thank you. So we've got a few themes going on throughout this presentation, and we could be here for 2 years without sleep, as Duncan mentioned, but I'm not going for that. What we're going to do is just give you a little bit of a flavour of a variety of themes, and some of them we're going to delve down into, some of them we're going to stay pretty high level. But the theme I'm going to have a look at now is cultural diversity. And this census, probably like no other in recent history, has shown just how culturally diverse Australia is becoming. So we've got over 180 countries of birth, over 300 different ancestries, over 300 different languages spoken in Australia. And these charts here break up the population in a number of ways. So if we look at the large circle first, it's got 3 dimensions to it. So first generation migrants are people like me, born overseas, who've come to live in Australia. So we're first generation Australians. And of people who reported a response to the country birth question, they make up 28.4% of the population. Then we have second generation Australians, and these are people who were born in Australia but had at least one parent born overseas, so there's still that immediate overseas connection. So in this census, we've come almost to a tipping point, or a midway point. Only slightly over half are third generation or more, so they were born in Australia and their parents are born in Australia. But the first and second generations are nearly counting for half of Australia's population. What's really interesting is when you look at our 2 big capital cities, and then you can see it's a different picture again. And Sydney really stands out there, but Melbourne is fairly close behind. So first generation Australians in Sydney make up 39% of Sydney's population. Second generation Australians, so born here but at least one parent overseas, make up 25, almost 26% of our population. So really, the contribution of first and second generation Australians to Sydney is 65% of the Sydney population, nearly 2/3. And in Melbourne, it's slightly smaller, it's 61.3%. So where do migrants live? Well, obviously quite a few of them live in Sydney and in Melbourne as well. The largest single group live in New South Wales, so just over 2 million of the state's population are first generation, they were born overseas. And in Victoria and New South Wales, roughly 28% of each of that state's population is overseas born. But just to have a look what's happened on the West Coast, and that's been a surprising figure to many people, is just how high the proportion of the population is that's overseas born in WA. In 2016, it was 32%. That's up from 31% in 2011. And you'll see that Tasmania, Duncan's best kept secret, has only got 12% of its population are overseas born. So the next few slides, I'm going to take a few views over time and over a few different geographies to just have a look at the changing face of migration in Australia. And this is a 50-year view of Australia's migrant population. So while the most common birthplace for those born overseas remains England at the Australia level, you can see that proportionally that's declined a lot from 50 years ago. So 50 years ago, so in 1966, Australia's overseas born population only accounted for 18% of the total population, but a third of that was made up of English migrants. So you can also see the red line there, and those are migrants from Italy. You can see New Zealand's featuring as well. And China and India are on there, but they make a very small proportion of the overseas born population. So looking at it, the European countries of birth featured on this graph have declined proportionally over 50 years. And we've seen some strong growth in the China and India born, the proportions that they contribute to the population. So let's have a look at the same graph, but for Sydney. So 50 years ago, in 1966, the overseas born population made up 22% of Sydney's population. And of course, we've got England there, probably about 30% of the overseas born population 50 years ago. You can see Italy is there as well, but we've also got the Greeks appearing in Sydney. And when we had a look at Melbourne yesterday, you really see the Greeks and Italians featuring quite strongly there as well. But fast forward 50 years and look at the share of the overseas born population that has been taken now by China ahead of England, and India is approaching the England-born population share of that. You can see Philippines has risen as well, and you can see that the other two European key countries of birth have declined proportionally over that period. So quite a change in the makeup. So we've had a look at Sydney. Now let's just pull out to New South Wales again, and let's look at what's happened in terms of the numbers of migrants from the top 10 countries of birth, excluding Australia, in between 2011 and 2016. So first of all, I'll say is that obviously Australia is the number one place of birth in New South Wales, accounting for about 65.5% of the population. So this is the overseas born population. So in 2011, represented in the orange, you can see that the largest single group was England, followed by China, New Zealand, India, and then Philippines and Vietnam were probably fairly similar. Look at 2016 though, you may not be able to tell off there, but the England-born has actually declined a small amount. But with the China-born and the India-born, we've seen some fairly significant increases. So the number of people living in New South Wales, born in China, has increased by over 50%, while for people born in India, it's over 70%. So let's go back to Sydney and the rest of New South Wales and see how they compare in terms of the makeup of the population. And the real standout figure to me are those, in each of those tables is the top line. So if you look at the Australia-born in Sydney, the Australia-born represent 57% of the population, but in the rest of New South Wales is over 80%. So quite a different makeup there. In the top 10 countries of birth for Sydney, we see a few European countries, so England's there. I won't count New Zealand as European, there are near neighbours. But there are more Asian countries listed within the top 10, whereas in the rest of New South Wales, we can see India, we can see Germany, Scotland and Italy. So there is a different mix depending where you live. And while this is apparent for Sydney and the rest of New South Wales, if you dive down into any particular suburb across Australia, you'll see a different mix again. So this is the beauty of the census. It allows you to do this and to be able to explore the diversity that's apparent across Australia. So let's have a look at another view of our migrant population, and this is just having a look at recent arrivals over the past 10 years. And you'll see that if you just focus on that group, you'll see that India makes up the highest single proportion, almost 14%, closely followed by China, 13.3%, then England, New Zealand, and the Philippines. And in fact, if we have a look at the top 7 countries of birth for recent arrivals in the past 10 years, 7 of those are from Asian countries. So this is a fantastic age-sex pyramid, I think. And what it does is take our overseas born and it splits them into 2 groups. And it shows very nicely that the European-born migrants in Australia are generally much older than the Asian-born. And this again is reflecting the recency or otherwise of the waves of migration. So a lot of the European-born migrants came after the Second World War into the 50s and the 60s. We had Greeks, Italians, a lot of English people coming, Germans, Scottish people, etc., etc. So the median age of the European-born in Australia is 59 years. The median age for Australians as a whole is 38. If we have a look at the median age of the Asian-born, it's 35, so it's considerably younger than the European-born. So let's have a look at where the biggest age cohorts are. So for the European-born, it's the 65 to 69-year age group is the biggest cohort. And for the Asian-born, it's the 30 to 34-year age group. So a lot of those people would have been fairly recently arrived, coming in for employment and educational opportunities as well. So another way of looking at cultural diversity, apart from country of birth, is having a look at people's ancestry. And we've got over 300 ancestries reported in the Australian census in 2016. An ancestry is an indication of the kind of cultural group that people feel they belong to or are affiliated with. And it just gives you a different picture. So interestingly enough, when you look at the top 10 ancestries, and we've only got 5 here, that a lot of those are dominated by European ancestries. So English is the top one. We've got Australian, Irish, Scottish. We've also got Chinese in there as well. But 7 of the top ancestries are European, and in addition to that, we've got Chinese and Indians being the exceptions. We've also seen in 2016 a number of new ancestries emerging that previously have not been apparent in Australia or have been very small. And when we pick 3 out for which we've received more than 5,000 responses, so a reasonable body of people there, 3 of them have increased dramatically over the last 5 years in terms of growth. So Chin ancestry, which is related to people from Myanmar, has grown by over 300% over the last 5 years. Punjabi increased by 191%, and then the Hazara has increased by 150%. So another element of looking at cultural diversity is the kind of languages that are spoken at home. And almost 3/4 of Australians say they speak English only. Now, that doesn't mean that the remainder don't speak English, but it means they speak other languages at home. Mandarin is the most common after English, followed by Arabic, Vietnamese and Cantonese. But we'll drill down in a few slides into one of Sydney's suburbs, and we'll see just how varied that can be depending where you live. Interestingly enough, we also ask people how well they speak English, if they speak another language at home, and the vast majority of people say they speak English well or very well. Just 3.5% report they don't speak English well or don't speak English at all. So Sydney homes, what's going on there? This is a 10-year view, so 2006 and 2016. And, reflecting that recent 10-year increase in migration from Asia, we've seen a drop in the proportion of people who say they speak English only. So it's gone down from 64% to 56.2%. And there's a number of languages there that have increased in terms of proportion of the population reporting them. And so Mandarin's more than doubled, Arabic's gone up, Cantonese has more or less stayed the same, Vietnamese has gone up, Korean, Spanish, Hindi, but Greek and Italian have gone down. So something that the census allows you to do, because we collect all this demographic information that you can check out a lot of these variables by, as well as all the geographic information, you can really zoom in on aspects that of cultural diversity that can be quite illuminating. And this is a graph of English proficiency by age. And it's graphing those people in Greater Sydney in the blue and in Australia in the orange who report they speak English not at all or at all well. And the thing that I think surprised me when I looked at this, particularly in Sydney, is how high the proportions are for older people. And that the 80 years and over, it's about 17% are reporting in Sydney that they either don't speak English well or not at all. They've got limited English. And for people aged 70 to 79 years, it's about 13%. So if you're thinking of the provision of aged care services, community care services, nursing home, etc., if you have a large proportion of this older population who has very limited English, then you really need to be cognizant of that in order to be able to plan services very well. Across all ages, the proportion of Australians who fit into this category is just 3.5%. So these are really some quite high proportions here. So if we focus in on Sydney in 2016, we've identified over 62,000 people over the age of 70 with limited English. So what are the languages they do speak? And you can see these are the top 5 languages spoken by this group of people. So there's Cantonese, there's Greek, Mandarin, Italian and Arabic. But also in the top 10, you see languages such as Croatian and Macedonian. So people who've been here for a while, but there still is that group with very limited English. So another element of how diverse we are and how we are diversifying over time is when you start having a look at people's religion. And this is one of the most hotly reported topics from the census this time. In fact, the ABC today on the website has a lovely article going into the suburbs, which either exhibit most non-religion or most Christianity. So it's all in there. You can see Sydney in there. You can see all the hotspots. So there's a 50, a 25 and a current view of Australia's reported religions. 50 years ago, almost 90% of Australians reported they had a Christian affiliation. Less than 1% said they had a religion other than Christianity, and less than 1% said they had no religion. So if we move forward 50 years, you can see how that picture has changed. So just over half of Australians now are reporting a Christian religion. 8.2% are reporting a religion other than Christianity, and 30% are reporting no religion. Now, that 30.1% is made up of about 29.6% who actually said no religion or tick the no religion box, and there's say about 0.5% in there of people who say they're atheists, agnostics, etc. And it's a story of age. And if you look at the people aged 18 to 34, you'll see that they're almost as likely to report no religion as they are a Christian religion. And they're far more likely than other age groups to report a religion other than Christianity. And that last fact there is reflecting the migrant population. We did have a look at people who are reporting no religion. We looked at it by whether they're born in Australia or overseas. Actually, if you're Australia born, you're more likely to report no religion. What we can see is that if you're an older person in Australia, you're far more likely to be reporting that you have a Christian religion. Nevertheless, there's still 16% saying no religion there. And under 18s, the pattern of reporting is very, very similar to people aged 35 to 49. That latter group is probably the parents reporting on behalf of children in a family. People fill out census forms in different ways. Some hand it around a household and ask each person to fill it in. If you're bossy like me, you fill it in on behalf of everybody, and away we go. So this is a comparison, again, drilling down a little bit in terms of the religious affiliations, the denominations for Australia and for Sydney. And there are some differences here in Sydney. Sydney has traditionally been a more Catholic state than many of the, more Catholic area than many other areas in Australia. And you can see that there's proportionally more people in Sydney say they are Catholic than in Australia. You can see that Uniting Church is less represented in Sydney than it is in Australia as a whole. Similarly with the Presbyterian and Reformed. But the Eastern Orthodox population is more represented in Sydney than it is in Australia. Another difference we see is in looking at religions other than Christianity. You'll see that there's proportionally a lot more people fit into that category in Sydney than they do in Australia. In Australia, the top religion other than Christianity is Islam, and that's reported by 2.6% of the population. In Sydney, it's 5.3%. And similarly, all the other religions that are not Christian are more highly reported in Sydney, and that reflects the migrant pattern. And interestingly enough, people in Sydney are less likely to report no religion than at the Australia level as well. So we've had a look across Sydney, we've had a look across New South Wales and Australia, and here's a suburb map, and we've taken the Australia-born out of the equation because quite frankly they would swamp everywhere. We know that Australia-born is the largest group across Sydney, so in order to be able to reveal some of the underlying diversity, we have to take those out, and we're left with the top countries of birth for each suburb. So, of course, within each suburb, there's quite a diversity. All we've done is pick the top one for the overseas born in each of those suburbs. So, the strong red colour is for China born. The strong green colour is India. The very boring grey colour, probably reflecting the age of many people from that country, is England. With the average age of 59, what do you expect? Vietnamese are represented there by a pale sort of pink. Greece is by quite a strong blue. But there's all sorts of variations within this map and some interesting groupings as well. So what we're going to do now is have a delve down into one of these suburbs which has a high proportion of people who are born overseas. So these are the top 5 in New South Wales. So there's Canterbury, Bankstown, Blacktown, Cumberland, Parramatta and Fairfield. And Fairfield has the highest proportion of the overseas born across all the LGAs in New South Wales. 54%, so over half of the population in the LGA is born overseas. So all those topics that we've been having a look at in this section, we've drawn a lot of them together here to present a picture of what Fairfield looks like. Fairfield in focus. So if we have a look at Fairfield, you can see that the ordering of the top countries of birth is really quite different to what we've seen across Sydney, across New South Wales. There's quite a bit of variation going on here. This is happening all across Australia. This is the beauty of the census. Pick a suburb, go in and have a look, and you'll see all its diversity. So the top overseas country of birth in Fairfield is Vietnam. We've got Iraq up there, Cambodia, China and Italy. So those are the top 5 overseas countries of birth in Fairfield. And that's reflected too in the languages spoken. So Vietnamese, Arabic, Assyrian, Neo-Aramaic, Cantonese and Khmer. What's different is, as well, is having a look at the religious affiliation of people in Fairfield. So Catholics are represented by 30.9% of the population, compared to just over 22% at the Australia level. So very well represented in Fairfield. Buddhism is really well represented as well. So at the Australia level, it's 2.4% of the population. In Fairfield, it's 20.7%. No religion is a lot lower. The Australia level, it's 30.1%. In Fairfield, it's 12.6%. Not stated, we have an optional question and some people don't answer it. Islam represents 5.9% of Fairfield's population. It's 2.6% at the national level. So it's a really interesting mix. So if nothing else, before I hand over to Duncan when you get home, go in and have a look at your suburb and see what the makeup of your suburb is, because it's just fascinating to have a look at.
Thanks, Sue. So when you get home, you'll probably join one of Australia's 6.1 million families. So we've seen with cultural and linguistic diversity significant change over the last 5 years. What we've seen in terms of our families is actually nowhere near as much change. It's a lot slower changing. So it's still the most common families we found in Australia were couple families with children, some 45% of families, followed by couples families without children, 38%, and single parent families with 16%. What you can see there with single parent families, 4 out of every 5 single parent family is a female or single parent family. So it's referring to the mother, not to everyone in the family, versus 1 in 5 are male or single parent families. You have to go back sort of 25 years to sort of see, I guess, a little bit of change going on here. So if we wind back 25 years, couples with children were 9 percentage points higher. So we're at 54% of families. And couples without children were 6 percentage points lower. So we're at some 32%. So to couples without children, that can be people who've never had children or don't have children, can also be empty nesters. So people who've managed to convince their kids somehow to get out of home. So one thing we have seen a big difference in over the last 5 years is the number of people reporting that they're in a same-sex couple. Also, the number of same-sex couples in Australia have increased by some 39% over the last 5 years. And over the 20 years that we've been capturing data on same-sex couples in the census has increased by 4.5 times, from a little bit over 10,000 to now 46,770. 51% of same-sex couples are male same-sex couples and 49% are female same-sex couples. Across Australia, the majority of same-sex couples live in New South Wales, but what this chart shows is actually the proportion of all couples in each state and territory. And so the highest proportion of same-sex couples are in the ACT, where 1.4% of all couples are same-sex couples, compared to 0.9% nationally and about 1% in New South Wales. Something else we've seen increase in the census is the number of people who are living in lone person households. So there's now over 2 million Australians who live alone. That's like the population of Western Australia. Again, not the population of Western Australia, but about the same size as the population of Western Australia. So some 8.7% of Australians live alone. And what you can see here is that there's a dramatic increase with age, particularly for females living alone. So there's actually, if we look at this alongside marital status, you can see 2 major things happening. So the first wave of increase that you see in the number of females living alone are people reporting that they're now divorced. And then in the second wave is actually widowed. So us blokes are carking it and leaving our wives to live alone in the later years. And so at 85 to 89-year-old, now 40% of all females in Australia are actually living alone. And across the 75 to 90-year-old age range, that's 1 in 3 of all females in that age range. The census also captures some information on whether or not people need assistance. So this is needing assistance with core activities, daily activities, is feeding yourself, movements around the house. And so what we can see here is a significant increase is over the time. We've seen actually in Australia the percentage overall increase from 4.6% of a population in 2011 to 5.1% in 2016. We've actually, you can see that at significant climb in later years, and in fact by age 85, 50% of women need some form of assistance and every day, whereas men hit that 50% mark around the 90 to 94-year-old age gap. But actually what we've seen is that the older ages, the percentage of the population is actually slightly lower requiring assistance. So people seem to be living healthier as they get older. But what we've seen is a significant increase in the younger ages. And you can see that little hump there in blue there for males in the younger age range. So with lots of people needing assistance, we have lots of great Australians who provide unpaid care for people with a disability or people with a long-term illness. And so some 2.1 million Australians provide this kind of care, and about 2/3 of the people providing care are females. And you can see that sort of a peak kind of age for providing care, 55 to 59, it's about 1 in 5 of every woman in Australia will be providing care for someone. And so you're seeing a significant amount of care provided by people who are still there in their later working years, and they're also providing unpaid care in addition to that. You do see an interesting crossover once you get to the 80 to 84 age group, where it's actually more men than women providing care, which actually lines up with that previous chart, which showed that the men's need for assistance actually comes in at a later age than females. This is our favourite grandparents chart. So this is providing unpaid care for children other than your own. So within the last couple of weeks, you've said someone's lobbed some kids on your doorstep and you provided some care for them without being paid for it. And so we can see here in some great grandparent ages of 60 to 69, and some 1 in 4 women in Australia are providing some unpaid care for children that aren't their own. We also see the grandfathers doing their bit there. So grandfathers there at 65 to 69, and some 14% of men are providing care for children, someone else's children. Another picture of the generosity of Australians is a picture of volunteering. Who's formally volunteered in a group or organisation within the last 12 months? And so what you can see here is actually people volunteer at nearly all ages in Australia. So that's sort of a lovely kind of picture. What you can see is 3 sort of peaks in this kind of chart. You've got what we've seen from other studies, the sort of a parenting kind of peak is the highest peak. So when you've got kids in school, you're volunteering at a footy club or of a school canteen or other things during that age. You've got a bit of a retirement peak. But what's also lovely in this picture is you've got this 15 to 19-year-old peak. So our young people are putting in a bit of effort to volunteer and help out in organisations. This is the slide that causes the most fights in census homes on census night. Is filling out the number of unpaid domestic work done over the last couple of weeks. I tried to convince my wife that despite it being census week and me not being home at all, but I should take my average from the previous 12 months. I lost that argument. So what we can see here is clearly still some different roles based on people's sex. So in the people doing 15 hours or more, or is 24.5% of women do 15 hours or more per week around the home, compared to only 8.5% of men. And some 21% of men are getting away with doing 0 hours a week, compared to some 14.5% of women. Before I get myself in more trouble, I'll hand back over to Sue.
Well, I think running a census is a pretty poor excuse for not doing any domestic work. And I'm sure it didn't fly with your wife either. So what I'm going to do now, we're going to change tack a little bit, and we're going to have a look at some census data which gives you some insights into Australians' economic well-being. So we're going to be having a look at income and how that varies across Australia. We're then going to have a look at housing costs, mortgage repayments, rent payments, and what proportion of the population what proportion of households are in mortgage and rental stress. So first of all, we'll start off with this map here, which shows you the median personal income for each state and territory. Now, we produce income on a number of levels. We've got median family incomes and median household incomes. So if these incomes look small to you, remember, it's just the midpoint. There's plenty of people earn more than that. Plenty of people have less than that coming in. It's just a midpoint measure. And I should add that this isn't just income from wages and salaries. This is income from benefits, from pensions, superannuation, all sorts of things. So in 2016, across Australia, the median personal income was $662. So if you have a look to the southeast of the map, you'll see the highest earners, and most of these are earners in the ACT, with $998 a week. Now, I'll just put a disclaimer on here. I work in Canberra, but I live across the border in New South Wales. So this has nothing to do with me. However, I will just point to my colleagues on the front row. So $998 a week. And let's have a look at where the next two highest incomes are received, and they're in two of our mining states and territories, in the Northern Territory and in Western Australia. So how does New South Wales fare? Well, $664 a week is the median personal income. Let's have a look at Duncan's favourite places, the best kept secrets of South Australia and Tasmania. You'll see they're fairly low in terms of their median personal income. And obviously a large contributor to that is they have older populations and a lot of retired people within those populations. So you would expect that to pull the median income down. So moving on to housing. This is a picture of Sydney and Australia, each over a period of 25 years. So this is the tenure type of the homes that people live in. So in 1991, in Sydney and Australia, the most common form of tenure type was for homes to be owned outright. So that means mortgages paid off and everything. If we move forward to 2016, you'll see that the proportion of people in Sydney who own the homes outright is now 29%. It's Australia slightly higher at 31%. 25 years ago in Sydney, just over a quarter of the population, or a quarter of the homes in Sydney were owned with a mortgage. In 2016, that's gone up to a third, and we've seen a similar increase across Australia as well. If we have a look in Sydney, though, the next category tells you what is the most common tenure type in Sydney. So 25 years ago, it was a home being owned outright. In 2016, it's a rented home. So in 2016, 34.1% of Sydney homes were rented, compared to 30.9% of Australian homes. So there's a higher chance, if you're living in Sydney, of you having a rented home than otherwise. Now look, part of that is to do with the fact that there's a younger population here, so you'd expect owning homes outright to be associated with older people. Also got a lot of migrants coming in and a lot of students. So that's certainly part of the picture, but not the whole picture. So the next few slides are going to be looking at the amounts that people pay to live in their homes. And this slide here is having a look at the median housing costs that people pay, their mortgage repayments in dollars per month. So again, you'll know plenty of people who are paying a lot more than this, and if you're lucky, you'll know some people who are paying less, but this is the median. So if we have a look, you can see that mortgage repayments are highest in Darwin, then in Sydney, than in the ACT and in Perth. So at the Australia level, the median mortgage repayment is $1,755 per month. In Darwin, which is the most expensive, it's $2,200, and in Sydney, $2,167. So 4 of the capital cities had median mortgage repayments in excess of $2,000 a month. So let's move on to the next slide. And this slide, what we've added in with the green lines is the proportion of households in each capital city and in Australia that are paying more than 30% of their monthly income on the mortgage. So if we have a look at that, there's some that really stand out. And Perth in particular has 9.3% of households are paying more than 30% of their income on the mortgage. So that's almost 1 in 10 households in Perth. In Sydney, it's 8.4%, and in Melbourne, it's 8.1% as well. Now, these 2 slides are focused on mortgage repayments. The next 2 we're going to have a look at are focusing on rental payments. And that's a different picture again. So these are housing costs for rent, and this is in dollars per week. Again, it's for the capital cities and it's for Australia. Now, at the Australia level, the median rental cost per week was $355. Sydney and Darwin were the only 2 capital cities where the median rent was over $400 a week. So Sydney was the highest at $440, which probably doesn't surprise anybody, and then Darwin was $420. So let's have a look at what that means for households as a proportion of their income. And what we're seeing on this slide is that there's a lot more households experiencing rental stress than mortgage stress. Now, one of the factors in mortgage stress not being as high as this is that interest rates have gone down. Yes, house prices have gone up, but interest rates have gone down. If we were to see interest rates go up, then you would see the proportion of households in mortgage stress going up as well. But this is rent, and if we have a look at rent, you'll see that Sydney clearly stands out. And what this graph shows you read these green marks off on the right-hand scale. 14.2% of Sydney households are paying more than 30% of their monthly income on rent. Brisbane, it's 13%, and the average for Australia, the median for Australia, is 11.5%. So if you add together the proportion of households experiencing mortgage stress and rental stress, that adds up to about 22.5% of Sydney households. So these next few slides are actually picking out suburbs where we're either looking at rental stress or mortgage stress. And this slide is picking out the top suburbs within New South Wales, paying with a large proportion of households with rent payments greater than 30% of the household income. And Haymarket, we could be in it, or we're not too far from it anyway. Nearly half of the households in Haymarket are paying more than 30% of their household income in rent. Now, I did go into our fabulous data set just before I came out, just to have a look at the type of people who are living in these suburbs, because what the mortgage picture tells you and the rental picture tells you, it's a tale of 2 cities. And the people living, I just picked out the top few there, the very young people. It's a lot of students, I would suspect, living in these areas. Let's have a look. In Chippendale, for example, and I think it's the same in Haymarket, 2/3 of the people living in those suburbs are aged between 20 and 34. So it's a very young population. As I say, I think a lot of people our students. So if we look at the whole of New South Wales at the bottom, you'll see it's almost 13% of households paying more than 30% of their income and rent, but nearly half in some of these suburbs at the top. And you'll see in Haymarket it's a pretty hefty rent as well. I'll just draw out the entrance, and I'll just draw out Lakemba and Fairfield. Those are much lower rents, but there's still high proportions of households experiencing rental stress in those areas. So, tale of two cities, let's have a look at the mortgage belt. And I hadn't heard of some of these places, so how do I find out about the kind of people who live in here? I went into the census. I went into Quick Stats, and we'll teach you how to do that soon. But you just go in, and it gives you a really good picture of who lives in these suburbs. So when I went and had a look at these top 4 suburbs here, I can see that there's a lot of young families. So young families with children. And I would say in a lot of these areas, they're probably new developments. It's probably their first house. What do you do when you're buying your first house? You probably max out your mortgage to the limit to be able to get into the market. So you can see that in Middleton Grange, which is out west, 22.1% of households in that suburb were paying more than 30% of their income on their mortgage, compared to a figure of 7.4% for New South Wales as a whole. Anyway, that's the end of the data presentation, but what I'll do now, because I know you're all dying to get into this data and find the various ways to get in, I'll hand back over to Duncan. Thank you.
Thanks, Sue. So Sue will get the exams ready, like you did know there was an exam. We're just going to do a bit of a quiz before you know. So accessing census data. So one of the great things about census data is it's free, like tonight. Nearly all of the data's up on the web and available for free. So just to give you a quick little bit of an intro on the data, we've got a whole range of different products that data's available in, and aimed at trying to make sure that no matter your level of interest, from starting interest to full-on nerd like myself, there was a product there for you. If you go to the ABS website, abs.gov.au, it's the best government website. Unfortunately, I'm bombed. The Bureau of Meteorology are a little bit more popular than us, and they don't even get the numbers right. Well, we get the numbers right. So if you come to abs.gov.au, you can click on the census button. There's not a red circle around it on the website. I suggested that, but the team said no, it's too much. Just click on the census at the top. It'll take you to this page. From this page, there's a search box there. You can type in one of any 80,000 geographies in Australia that you're interested in, and it'll bring up the quick stats for that area. There's a little drop down there. You can go back and look at 2011, 2006, 2001, and so you can look at a whole range of different dates. So it brings up quick stats, which is our most sort of simple kind of product. You've got down in the corner there census stories. They're just articles, infographics, things that we create that are just great to look at on a weekend. And through the middle there, you've got access to all of our other products. So our analytical products, they're beautiful little charts, things like we've shown you today. And so we pick out areas that we know are going to be of interest: cultural and linguistic diversity, religion, ageing population, and we'll try and bring out some of the insights about information to make it easier for you and easier for journalists of Australia. Now, if you go and look at quick stats, it'll bring up nice little web pages that'll give you quite a bit of information across all our topics on a particular area. But it'll give you the top 3 or the top 5 countries of birth or languages spoken, and really give you sort of a bit of a flavour for an area. And all of my mates seem to think that I might know every single number that we've collected in the census. So whenever we're somewhere, they say, "How many people live in Albury, Duncan? You're the census guy." And so luckily Quick Stats is my friend, and I can bring up those numbers and get myself out of trouble. So important with Quick Stats is when you bring it up, have a look at the map, because if you say look at Sydney, there's a whole lot of different Sydneys you could look at. There's a Sydney CBD, there's Greater Sydney, there's probably an electorate called Sydney, like there's so many different Sydneys. So have a look at the map to make sure it is what you're looking at. Because otherwise you'll be one of Australia's mayors who will go on the radio and say, my population's disappeared, and we have to give them a call and tell them that they're looking at the wrong population. Yes, I've got a few mayors on speed dial. You can go on to community profiles. If Quick Stats isn't enough, community profiles are a spreadsheet product which give you even more data. So rather than having the top 5 countries of birth, it'll have the top 35 countries of birth. And so it gives you a lot more data in there. We've got a few different community profiles too. There's a general one, but there's a time series one too. So within one nice spreadsheet, you can see how an area has changed over time. Some people still aren't satisfied and they go on to data packs. Data packs got released today, very exciting. And so this allows you to download massive files full of our aggregated data. And so lots of people download these to feed into their own systems and their own models, or to sell them on to other people at a profit. So if someone's selling you a data pack, realise it's free on the website. Table Builder is where I have lots of fun. So Table Builder is where you know that you're smarter than the ABS and you know what table you're going to build yourself. You can put in whatever you want in your columns, whatever you want in your rows, and build your own tables. You can look at them in a map view, you can look at them in table view. So if you want to look at country of birth by language spoken by year of arrival, you can chuck all of those things in a table and hit go. We launched Table Builder last week, a couple of months earlier than we've ever released it before. We had 1.6 billion cells of information accessed in the first day. Someone actually built a table with 39 million cells in one table, and it chugged away and got there and served up that table. So we've released most of our data, but actually there's still more to come. So whilst we've released most of our data already, we've got another release of data in October. So in October is when we bring out information on people's labour force participation, their occupation, their industry, how they got to work, where they've moved from 1 year ago or 5 years ago. So some of those topics take a little bit more time for us to get ready. So we've still got odd people working hard on those to get those out in October. And then from December and into next year, we're still busy bringing out some more things. So December, we're excited about bringing out Australia's census longitudinal data set. So we've now got a data set which will have 2006, 2011 and 2016, and it shows you how populations sort of changed over time. And so a great example of what we used the longitudinal data set for was that people wanted to understand car manufacturing in Geelong and how that had changed with the Ford factory closing down. So you could actually look at people working in car manufacturing in 2006 and see what their labour force status was in 2011. Had they moved on to different industries? Had they moved on to different employment? And so rather than just what we usually get with census, which is just a snapshot at a point in time. Okay, so we've got a couple of roving mics, so we're going to take some questions for a few minutes, and then after the questions, Sue and I are going to hang around and keep talking to people who want to talk to us. And we've also got some of my fantastic colleagues here from work who can actually show you some products, show you why our website's better than Bureau of Meteorology, and help you out with any other queries you have. But if we've got any questions, we've got a couple of roving mics. We need to give a mic to you because of our webcasting. Just chuck your hand up and someone will get a mic to you. Thanks, Karina. Thanks, Beck. So, any questions?
Hey, thank you for a very entertaining presentation. I'm just wondering when or if the census data is going to be available at more disaggregated income levels. So income binning has been, and top coding has been a scourge of my existence for the entire time I've been in Australia. I'm a first-generation immigrant, as you can probably tell from the accent. And particularly with inequality increasing, we really want to know what's going on in that top 2%, and we can't see it. So when is that changing?
Yeah, good question. So we actually added a number of extra ranges this census. So in order to get a bit more breakdown. I think we went from 8 categories to 11 categories. We actually did some testing as well on getting rid of the tick boxes and having people just write in the income. We weren't happy with the results of that testing. What I think we actually need to do is be better at bringing together census data with other data sets in order to give that picture better. So we're already doing that with things like visa status. So we publish a product later this year which brings in visa status so you can understand humanitarian migrants versus skilled migrants. We should be able to do that with income as well. So the tax office already disseminate small area data based on income. So I think that's probably going to be the answer for us in terms of getting better income data in the census.
Hi, thanks for that talk. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the difference in the net undercount responses between different age groups in particular. I think a 1% net undercount rate is phenomenal, so well done after what happened last year, but just talk a bit more about how that might have differed for particular population groups.
Yeah.
Well, I'll kick off with the country of birth, and then Duncan can take some of the other things. What we saw in 2016 was a phenomenal result for people who were born overseas. In 2011, we had quite high undercounts, so say people born in China and India, and I think one of them was like near 16% undercount. It came down dramatically in 2016, and I think one of the reasons for that is that people born in India and China went online in a big way, huge way, so nearly between 85 and 90%. So that's a really good news story. In a lot of our overseas countries of birth, particularly the younger ones from Asia, obviously very technologically capable, quite willing to go online, they did, and we obviously did a better job engaging through universities, etc. And we've seen big decreases in the net undercount there. Where we haven't seen an improvement, but we haven't seen anything get worse either, is with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population. In 2011, there was a 17.2% undercount. It's 17.5 in 2016, and with the standard error, it probably means it's roughly the same. So that's disappointing to us, and that's something we've got to do better on. And I think we'll be putting our focus into that more next time as well. But I'll hand over to Duncan to see what you can dredge up from your brain in terms of age, because
So yeah, not every age group's equally represented in the census. We have a phenomenon that people forget their babies. So we always are missing babies in the census, comes up every time. But we also, we tested this form which actually showed a stick figure picture of your family at the end to sort of say, like, is this everyone? But but we decided not to go down that path. But for one of the groups which have always been the hardest to count are young adults. And when we've done sort of testing and looked into that, it's not actually largely because young adults don't care or don't want to be counted. They're actually hard to get to. Like they tend to be flat out studying and working in evenings. They tend to be, no one's quite sure, are they living at their girlfriend's place or are they still living at home because the washing keeps turning up every week. So what we've seen in this census is no improvement to the sort of undercount of younger, so 20 to 34-year-olds. So it's sort of stayed about the same, which is better than it getting worse, which is what we've seen in the last few censuses. But what we've actually seen in the older age groups is that we've always had a little bit of an overcount of older age groups. And it's fed by a couple of different things. It's fed by sometimes people doing forms more than once. So older age groups are more likely to be travelling for work or whatever. And so they might fill in a form at a hotel and at home. Or get stressed about filling out the census and fill out as many as they can. But also, what we also see is that part of our process in the census is we know that it was only a 95% response rate. So we try and add in the other 5% to make sure the census is complete. And when we add people into the population, you have to base that on people which have already responded, and because older people are more likely to respond, it actually perpetuates that a little bit. So we publish all the figures on that, so you can see basically small undercounts at younger ages, small overcounts at older ages. And we adjust for that when we produce the population estimates, which is why we measure for that.
Hi. I've got a question around, so I'm from the UK, and last time there was a UK census, I was reading in the news that the Conservative government at the time were thinking around doing away with the one-off censuses and using credit reference agencies and utility bills and all sorts of stuff, and I'm just thinking, is that the kind of direction you think you guys will move in, or is it nice to have this point in time type of data?
I was really pleased that the Conservative government in the UK, so they made a commitment. They said if we got elected, there will be no more censuses. And I'm in the UK, and then they got elected, and they were going, oh my goodness, like we've made this commitment. And so what they did was they funded the ONS to investigate what the alternatives are to a census. And the reason why I was keen on it was that the UK then put together an international advisory panel to help them out with that assessment. And so I got a few trips to London to help advise those on this process. So I know a little bit about their journey. And so what they found was that, yeah, if you looked at the national health records in the UK, and you looked at school enrolments, and you looked at births, deaths and marriages, and you munched it all together, you could actually get a pretty good picture nationally of what the population count was. So it was pretty accurate. You could actually even get it down to a level of about 200,000 people. Like, you could get pretty good age profiles and stuff. But if you then tried to get down to smaller areas, it's all over the shop. You don't know where people are moving and where people are going. What you also find is that you only get really basic demographics. So you don't get... So we've got 61 questions across 45 topics. You've got all of these dimensions, which don't exist in those kind of data sets. I think our future is probably a little bit more like New Zealand's future. So New Zealand are doing a lot of work with using census alongside other data sets and data sources. And what they've found is that the more that you use census with other data sets, the actually more valuable the census becomes as a basis of your statistical picture. So we're definitely looking at things there, and we use administrative data in order to do our quarterly population estimates and our regular kind of pictures. But at the moment, and the census is just such a valuable way of bringing that picture together. What we also did in this census was, for the first time in Australia, we actually ran a census which was cheaper per person. So we saved over $100 million this census. So we've got a census which is used to distribute well over $100 billion as of GST funding, which we reduced the operating cost in census year from over 300 million to just over 200 million. So it's actually, I think, a bargain. Keeps me paid too, so.
Yeah. It's a fair question though, and look, I think governments are going to keep coming back and saying, can't you, we've got all this administrative data, why can't you use this, why can't you make more of it? So I think, every few years, each of the key countries, so we talk very frequently to colleagues in the US, in Canada, New Zealand, UK, well, England, Scotland, etc. And we're all going through the same kind of pressures and answering the same kind of questions as well. And I know New Zealand is on a trajectory to using more and more administrative data, but they're not there yet. And we're all following that sort of same pattern.
Might take a couple more.
Hi, can you tell us a little bit more about the longitudinal data that's going to be released December this year? Like, what kind of information would that provide? Like, what are the focus areas, etc.?
Yeah, so what the longitudinal census data set is it's a 5% sample of the Australian census in complete each file, sort of linked together between censuses. So we actually, between 2006 and 2011, and we had to use people's date of births, their area that they lived in, their marital status, other characteristics to try and work out, is this person this person? And link that together in order to understand at a person level, which then allows you to understand at a group level how things change over time. So, and what we'll do in 2016 is find that 5% of people and add that in to get at three time it's over time. And so it's a 5% of Australian population, so it's about 1 million records. And so amongst 1 million records, so one of the other studies which was undertaken was looking at, so last census we had an increase of 20% of people identifying as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander origin. This census was 18%. So you could actually look at it and say, okay, right, so who didn't identify 5 years ago and who are identifying now? What are their characteristics? Because by being able to do that, it's really important to understand, but if you're looking at a closing the gap measure or some kind of comparison, and are we comparing apples of apples here, or is there an apples of oranges kind of comparison? And so, it's a full census data set. It's also some of the enhanced things that we add to the census data set. So like visa status, that we add to the census data set. So you can see, again, and I'm sure people will have a look at, so people who arrived on skilled visas, what's their transition over 10 years in terms of their proficiency in English, in terms of their moving around, their dwelling situation, that kind of picture. So it's an incredibly powerful way of understanding, and that's where we're at as a country. We're a sophisticated country now who are trying to design sophisticated policies to help the people of Australia, and we need good data to do that. One up here. Okay.
Sorry, two questions. They're quite different topics. The first one, you've talked about bringing in other data sources. So are there particular areas that you think are most likely to be mashed up in terms of data sources and synchronised with census data? And would it be within a particular tool like the table builder? What's your vision? What are you saying?
Well, we already have. We've embarked on that after 2011. We just want to be able to do more of it, and the results of that are sort of up on the website. Medicare benefit schedule data, pharmaceutical benefit schedule data has been, linked up, trying to match the characteristics of a person in this data set with a person in that, and saying, well, do we think it's that same person, and mash it together. That was done either last year or the year before. Because a lot of these administrative data sets have very limited demographic information and family information as well. What kind of families do these people live in? And it provided some really good insights into usage of particular types of pharmaceuticals for particular conditions. So that was really illuminating. That was some work done for the National Health and Medical Research Council. That's been put up on the website. So there's lots of possibilities for things that we can do. We are an accredited data linking agency, which means there's various hoops you have to jump through to be accredited to do that. It's all done very safely. We've got a lot of governance structures in place. We've got legislation to cover that as well. But it can really add value. The census adds so much value to these administrative data sets that it's just huge. So I suspect we'll be doing a lot more of it in the future.
So it's been a journey that we've been on slowly since 2006 because we wanted to make sure that as we do this, we can do it safely, and as we do this, we can do it in a way that we can show the value of it, but also over protections which are in place. And so some of it, I guess, were fundamental protections which are in place, which have been in place for us for over 100 years now, is that any data that the ABS has can't ever be used for compliance purposes, can't ever be provided to courts or tribunals, and can never be released in a way that could identify an individual. So it means that in some ways we're frustrating the rest of government because our data, we can do all of this great stuff, but it's just for statistical benefits. It's to provide sort of aggregate kind of pictures.
And the second question, just in terms of privacy issues and with the website being taken offline, were there any particular question areas where you felt that people didn't answer quite as accurately as they might have had those issues not occurred? And how did you, I guess, correct that or smooth that effect?
Yeah, no, very good question. So it was, I mentioned briefly in passing earlier that we formed an independent panel this census. So this independent panel was chaired by Sandra Harding, who's the Vice-Chancellor of James Cook University, had Professor Peter McDonald, who's one of Australia's principal demographers, is on the panel. Had Dennis Chuen, a former Australian statistician. Had Peter Morrison, who's a former deputy statistician from Canada, on it. So this group got together, and that was one of the questions they wanted to explore and understand. And so they've come out with some quite strong statements that they can't see that privacy concerns have led to any significant impact on the quality of census data. The couple of things that they did notice, so they looked at things like income and things like religion, optional kind of questions. Both of those we actually had less left blank this census than previous ones. We confront that against other data sources, so surveys and the like, and the data aligns with our expectations in those areas. What we did see was that more people reported this census their age rather than their date of birth. We give that as an option to people. You can either put forward one or the other. And we think that reflects potentially some of the privacy conversation, but we think that also reflects just societal awareness around security and privacy. I tell my kids, you never give anyone your date of birth online. Like this is something that we're training and conditioning people to do. And so if you give people an option, one or the other, well, put the age in. So we saw that change. We also saw a decrease in the number of people indicate that they want their data transferred to the National Archives and kept for 99 years. Don't know why, but less people want their data released in 99 years time by the National Archives. But in terms of our questions, in terms of our data, we saw actually lower levels of blank responses in those and really high quality data. So we're pretty wrapped with that. I did say that was the last question. And, I think I'd wrap it up there. I'm not going anywhere, so I'm very happy to keep answering questions. I want people to have a chance to be able to leave. But thank you so much for coming along.